Friends and colleagues, this is an enormous topic. I'm glad I got a sense of a little bit of where people are coming from, and so I'm going to try to do a talk on the revolutionary ideas of Karl Marx, The World to Win. If I'm missing a few things, there are 50 volumes of the collected works of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels that you could go and look at. And also that Marx is probably the single most maligned and celebrated author of the 19th century. Maligned by some, celebrated by others who are in fact maligning him. And it's a pretty tricky operation, and I'll try to explain some of that. It led Karl Marx in his day to exclaim in frustration in French. Now, I don't know if the frustration was expressed in French. Je ne suis pas Marxiste, which means in translation, after a little bit of snobbery for the videotape and show that my accent is good, it simply means I am not a Marxist, because of the way in which his ideas were being used by others. So what I'm trying to say is it's an enormous topic, and I can't possibly do justice to it, so I'll try to hit on a few of the themes. Also acknowledging from the beginning that people call things that they may not be, so that we have, or had, around the world a series of very oppressive states for whom Marxism was the guiding beacon, but in fact, just like democracy is the guiding beacon in this country, and freedom, Marxism in those countries was the religion that helped maintain the order. In the same way as a country that declared itself free in order to enslave black people, you had, in other parts of the world, Marxism was what you get when you die, a little bit like religion, but not at this stage in the development of socialism. Because right now is the time where you have to work for the betterment of society. Steve, if your phone goes off again, okay, we just had to do a Steve joke. It'll be the penultimate one before I finish the talk. So that's just as a quick introduction of the kinds of difficulties in discussing the subject of Marxism. I want to raise another problem with discussing Marxism, in that I think that there are few times in history in which the world cries out for change, and the lack of political alternatives that people have to rely on or to reach for in order to change it. And I think that that's a particularly distressing situation, especially for the last generation, the last two generations of political activists. I don't mean that it weighs less heavily on older ones, but I'll come back to the question of age in a minute. But I think the fact that the slogan, the 1% versus the 99%, is so broadly and widely accepted that you can't turn on, well, you can certainly turn on Colbert and Daly and get an astounding kind of series of critiques in a certain way, and obviously comedic, but the point isn't lost on anybody, that the world is dominated, run by, and for the tiny handful of people who have power, money, reach, and the like. That's not an idea that was commonly accepted, in particular in this country. I believe that internationally it's much more accepted, but the corollary, therefore, what do we do and how do we change it, is much weaker in many respects than it's been in a long, long time. And we have to provide, it seems to me, some explanation about that. And I'm not talking simply a change in the way people view the world in the last 6 or 7 years, although I would insist, and I'll try to put forward, there's been a phenomenal change in the way people see the world in the last 5 or 6 years. But I mean, over a much longer period of time, there's been a kind of ideological loss of ideological compass of can change happen, will change happen, which is a very complicated process, some of which to do with the collapse of countries that call themselves socialist, leaving people to some confusion. Others, the ideological void was created by the literal turning away from revolution and social change that many of the strongest participants were involved in. I mean, you just think of South Africa and the beacon that South Africa was for people who believed in justice, in human emancipation, in anti-racism, in women's rights. And Mandela finally is freed. And many years later, you look and you say, my good God, what is it that we achieved? Someone like Cyril Ramaphosa, who people won't remember, but I remember when Cyril Ramaphosa was the leader of the mine workers union in South Africa, is today's richest man in South Africa. That leads to a certain mind, sorry, I wasn't going to use it, mind warp. That's the better word. When you look at the leaders of many of the Central American revolutions who traded in the guerrilla outfits for a seat at the table, and you know, kind of, it was an expression or a kind of, it helped increase the view, as Margaret Thatcher put it, of Tina. There is no alternative. Now, that I think weighs very heavily on people, but not just that, because when struggles did emerge, and Seattle is one of the places, I used to always love Seattle because of, well, because of Bruce Lee and Jimi Hendrix. And then I discovered that they actually drove him out of Seattle, and I thought, okay, fuck Seattle. Okay. And then Starbucks and Microsoft. See, I worked on this joke, and I thought, I'm never going back there. Plus, I smoke, and that's not very kosher. But Seattle 1999 represents a great point of the revival of the movement, but 10 years on, people go, well, what happened? And where is it? And the structures still seem to be in place. So I'm talking about a world to win. I'm not out to depress you, even though I'm doing a good job at it so far. Because I think that's what leads to a lot of the questioning, and unless we grapple with the real questions, we're not going to get any real solutions. I could tell you the struggle is going onwards and upwards, and from the electoral campaign of Jesse Hagopian, which didn't win, but the next time will, and the election of one council person in Seattle, it's onwards and upwards. I'm afraid to say that actually the results of the European elections are slightly more significant as to where the other ideological break is taking place, which is a break from the center to the far right. So that what I'm going to try to show is that in the last 5 or 6 years, there's a renewed interest in Marxism, an affirmation of the importance of his and of Frederick Engels and of the Marxist movement's contribution, but that the question of organization and agency still remains very large for people, because they say, I agree, but can you really change City Hall? I don't mean to, I know most people's horizons are slightly larger than City Hall, but I'm using it as an example. And I have to pretend I know what's going on here by re-entering my password to get the text. As an example, not of the break to the right, but of the break to the left, people may have heard of a book by a man called Thomas Piketty, a French economist, who wrote a book sometime last year, which was translated into English and is now the bestseller, both in the United States and internationally. Now, I want to just read you a little summary of what Piketty's book contains from the New York Times, in which the book is described as, quote, a 600-plus page work that convincingly warns readers that rising global wealth and income inequality over the past generation is actually the norm for capitalist economies, and that we should expect the trend to continue in the years to come. And another New York Times columnist writes, Marxist ideas are having intellectual moments and attention must be paid. Now, of course, and I want to get into Marx, but I think that's very true. But people should also know a few things about Piketty. The book isn't written to endorse Marxist economics. The book is actually written in part as a critique of Marxism, but he can't escape the reality of what historically capitalism has done. For those who can't read the 600-page book, you may want to read a short interview with Piketty in New Left Review, the Left Journal, and I want to just read you 2 quotes of it in order to get into the discussion of Marxism. And I realize I'm going a little too slowly, so I'll resolve the problem by talking just a lot faster. Piketty writes, the lessening of income inequalities between 1914 and 45 was due both to the shocks of the world wars and to the policy responses that followed. And basically what he shows is that the only reason more state intervention took place was in reaction to powerful working class and social movements that raised the question. He says there was nothing intrinsic in capitalism to, as the old saying was, what was the saying? Sprinkle downwards, trickle downwards, sprinkle. All right, trickle downwards. That's got nothing to do with it. It was in hit 'em, piddle. Okay, listen now. That's 3. Very good. You are going to come up with a 4th, I'm sure. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do, that is, the reforms simply had to do with the pressure, and above all, the pressure of the Bolshevik Revolution, and of, in many ways, the growth of a Marxist opposition to capitalism, not because of some self-regulating aspect of the system. And that the years following the Second World War until 1970 really represented the attempt to recreate a social equilibrium, or what was known in many countries as a social pact. And I go through all that to say what Piketty assumes, and I think the reality of the last 30 to 40 years shows it, is that social pact is over as far as the ruling classes of the world are concerned. Now, something about Marxism. Marx was, as most people will know, not the first socialist by any means. There was a socialist movement prior to Marx. He relied heavily on 3 sources for the formation of his ideas. And by the way, for Marx, I mean Marx and Engels. And I'm going to try to do this fairly quickly. So please, in the discussion, if I've skipped over stuff or didn't make a strong enough case, I just need to move on to explain what happened to Marxism and where we can go from here. Marx's basic view, well, he was not the first socialist, and like anybody else interested in the fight against oppression and the fight for justice, always sided with the underdog. I mean, he began as an opponent. His first political writings were to insist on the freedom of the press. He had been hired as an editor of a newspaper, and his first article was for the right to say what you think, an idea which is kind of novel today, especially when you associate the word press with it. Think of another, okay. So that's, in terms of Marx, it was sympathy to those who resist the existing order, asked in a board game that he used to play, I don't know, one of these 19th century boards, I don't know, I'm told they took place. It'd be, I don't know, a 19th century video game, shared in by the family. And the daughter, Eleanor Marx, says, it's not really a video game, okay, I'm not crazy. It was a board game, and his daughter says, who's your hero? And he answers, Spartacus. In other words, the fight against oppression. When I said he wasn't the first socialist, it seems like some time ago, and his ideas came from 3 places. It was English political economy, that is, the analysis of what the system was, German philosophy, and French political action. And I say action because the French Revolution was the reference point for everyone, the same way the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution became the reference points in the 20th century for many people. In the 19th century, and really from the 18th into the 19th century, the French Revolution was the model. And from those 3 sources, Marx became a radical, then a socialist, but there were many others. What was distinct about Marx and Engels was that they opposed what they described as the utopian socialists. They were quite sympathetic to them. I mean, these are good people, but they believed that their ideas were flawed fundamentally. First, because the utopians, it's complicated here. The utopians were known, okay, the utopian socialists believed in either educating people out of their poor character, common term at the time, or I think failed states has replaced that today, but anyway, people of poor character or people who just lived in the muck, by either creating communities that would be pure and socialistic, in which people cooperate and share rather than compete, or you would convince people out of their poor ideas. Marx and Engels' initial objection was this idea is completely elitist. Because how is it that these people got to pure consciousness, whereas we can't? We have to be educated by them or live with them. Sorry, that's a joke, but in other words, either be in a commune, and there really were a lot of communes all over the United States trying to be more cooperative and so on. And Marx and Engels said, these ideas are intrinsically elitist. And he has a famous phrase, who will educate the educators? No, nothing intended there. Meaning by that, who will teach the teachers? And he comes up later with the formulation, which I'm summarizing, people should read. He said, no, in order for society to change, it isn't sufficient to have better ideas. You have to engage in practice, in struggle, because it is only struggle which can challenge the order of rulers, and secondly, that is the only way in which people who have been deprived and oppressed and exploited can become fit to rule. In other words, it's not a question of being told, you should love your fellow man or fellow woman or blah, 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 fellow woman. There's a good one on tape. You should love. But you need to both engage in struggle in order to change. In other words, the elitism that was involved in the ideas of the utopian socialists could be overcome only through practice and mass democratic engagement. Number two, if you believe I'm only on number two, and we're at 50 volumes, so we're getting there. Number two, Marx and Engels argued that the ideas of the utopians were ahistorical. And what did he mean, in what sense? He meant that there has been class society throughout history. There's been oppression, there's been bigotry, there's been racism, not throughout history, but in particular, we can discuss how and when that arises. But there's been ills throughout human history. In order to get over it, you have to understand something about the political economy of the societies that we're talking about. And he basically began to develop the idea that depending on the level of the development of the economic forces of production, can you envision a society structured in a different way? Put altogether differently, you can't have a socialism, a society based on plenty and cooperation when scarcity is the rule. Because people will fight over meager resources. In fact, he says in one stage, any attempt to create such a society of equality without having the proper level of economic development will lead to all the old crap reviving again. So that the question of the economic level of development of society had an enormous impact on his thinking. And he says, capitalism, as a social system, creates the possibility of thinking of a society of equality because it has released so much productive capacity that in fact, as capitalism develops, it will reach a stage in which itself, capitalism puts a fetter on its own development because it can't develop any further profitably. And the relations of production, I'm using his terms, that is the way in which society is organized, come into conflict with the mode of production. Now, what on earth does that mean? It means that it's been acknowledged since 1950 or 60 that the world could be fed. That hunger could be wiped out. It isn't done because that would affect the profits of huge conglomerates and a disequilibrium in the system, because of course you don't give anything away. Because after all, if you give it away, you get the idea. If you don't, go watch Fox News. But I'm just cutting corners here, but that's the essence of the case that Marx makes about the system. He made one last observation, which is that the system has the tendency for inbuilt crises. Because if you read the Communist Manifesto, it's quite a lauding version. You know, he looks at capitalism and said, this thing has really advanced human progress. If it were just that, well, then you'd tinker and try to change it. But Marx says that the system has a tendency towards greater and greater concentration, both of the economic resources, of the wealth, of the means of production of the society, and goes into periodic crises which will get worse and worse. Now, there's been a lot of ink spilled on, have they gotten worse? Was he right? There's certain debates that, you know, at one stage he says, the immiseration of the working class. And people say, workers are a lot better off today than they were in the 19th century. Now that argument's taken a knock because most American workers are worse off than they were 30 years ago in a whole number of measurements. But Marx was not a complete fool. He meant the immiseration of the working class in relationship to what's being produced. So what you're getting produced is ever greater wealth for an ever smaller share on the part of the working class. Problem, how do you change it? That's the open question, Marx. Now, Marx and Engels themselves were absolutely decisively clear with the first point of differentiation that they made with utopian socialists, where they said this is an elitist view. They said you have to engage in struggle. You know, at Marx's funeral, and you'll get a much better kind of summary of what Marx believed from Engels than from me. It's a wonderful, seriously, he tells you what Marx stood for in 3 or 4 phrases, which are very moving. And at the end he said, above all, Marx was a fighter. He liked to engage in a good battle. And I say that, thank you for this. I'd like an Egyptian. But, Marx was known, by the way, as a brawler as well. After Pops, he was arrested on many an occasion, he and Engels. But what Engels meant was that he was a fighter and that you had to immerse yourself in the struggles of the day in order to come out. But the question of political organization, political representation, Marx and Engels talked about much less. That is, they were engaged in the creation of the International Working Men's Association, as it was called in 1867, but as a result of a series of quite lengthy splits and polemics between different political currents, in particular Mikhail Bakunin, the anarchist, they shipped the International Working Men's Association to have its headquarters in New York, where they knew it would sink and die. It did. But it meant that the movement in Europe was freed of these interminable polemics, and I said shipped it to New York to die. The United States was a booming economy. You're not going to have the development in the 1870s of a stable mass labor movement of the kind that you had, in Europe. Now, the fact that the question of political organization was not particularly addressed by Marx meant that you had a series of developments of the growth of political organization that aimed at socialism, some of which were Marxist, some of which were really influenced by other types of socialist ideas. In particular, the question of reform socialism. And here, Marx initially left open the possibility that you could achieve socialism purely through the ballot box. He actually had a piece in which he was thinking out loud and said, in Britain, where the working class is getting the vote, there's more education, maybe we can get power through electoral means. In 1871, as a result of of an uprising called the Paris Commune, Marx changed his views completely because the Paris Commune was hugely democratic. People expressed their will through the ballot box, and it was put down by the force of arms, which taught him a lesson we've learned many times since then. If you don't vote the right way, those who hold power will suppress you until you get the vote right, or possibly take away the right to vote. And here I'm being facetious about something that's quite serious, and I shouldn't be. Chile in 1973, I know most people are not old enough to remember it, but you have a democratically elected government that speaks of socialism, and by the way, quite mild in some of the reforms that it wants to take, but immediately the secret state takes over and decides to destabilize the regime. And people should, for those people who are interested in social change and revolution, should read about the Chilean Revolution, in particular a book by Peter Kornblue, where the documents are released, and it's astonishing, because behind the facade of democracy, what they actually did, for example, in the 1964 election in Chile, is spend more money on the Chilean election that was spent in the US presidential election of that year. Just gives you an idea of how seriously they took it. And that Kissinger and Nixon, without even telling the rest of the state machine, that is the armed forces or the rest of the NSA, undertook the assassination of the one left-wing general that Allende was in solidarity with, and then, you read, sent a message about the infamy and black day that scourged the world as a result of this man's assassination, signed Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. I mean, it's so, if you understand what happened, they just killed the guy and they sent the telegram wishing his family well, type of thing. Now, I take that digression because the question of form of political organization and the question of which road to power, how do you actually achieve it, became the main dividing lines of the socialist motion. I'm at 10. And I think that it's important to consider that, because the bulk of the difficulties that I believe that we face today stem from that problem. Not because Marx and Engels didn't anticipate this development or did anticipate that one. And by the way, nobody writing in the 19th century can get everything right for the 21st century. There's no point in trying to say that. That's really not what I'm saying. But the basics of the analysis that they put forward, I believe still fits, and I believe is the foundation for the development of further analysis and critiques and methods of investigating how, in practice and intellectually, and the two come together, we can transform what is a terrible system. But the problem still remains that we seem to be very far away from it. You know, I was going to ask as a kind of trick question, anybody here support the 1%? No, but then it's not necessarily clear what people do support or how we advance. And I just want to take a few minutes in summarizing the talk to lay out a couple of big problems. The first is that the first workers' state, or attempt to establish working class democracy, failed, and that was in Russia. And what went from a state that was a beacon to others became itself a totalitarian machine. Now that tends to crimp your style. And to be more specific, the most committed political activists were tied to that project. A very few had the courage or the wherewithal to see through it in the beginning. You know, it's one thing 30 years on or 50 years on, but it was another. I mean, the revolution was in 1917. The process of degeneration is complete, in my opinion, by 1928. But with the rise of fascism in Germany as another pressure, are you really going to become a critic of the Soviet Union? I mean, there was a real material pressure. Plus, it appeared that the USSR was growing economically while the capitalist world was sinking into depression. So people stayed, but it meant that you also had an ideological and political framework that was no longer a framework based on what the mass of workers needed or their interests, but you were following the dictates of a state. And so you had disaster after disaster. Because, for example, people don't know this about the history of the Communist Party. The Communist Party in this country became an organization of close to 1 million people and recruited and did phenomenal anti-racist work across the country. I mean, some of the most courageous, practical work. I mean, you know, when you hear stories of two New York Jews moving into South Carolina and North Carolina and organizing sharecroppers unions, and what actually happens, and the heroism that people displayed, and the breaking of Jim Crowism, and so on. That's one side of it. But people who don't hear is that a large number of the black folks who joined the Communist Party left it after the invasion of Ethiopia and its support by, anyway, it becomes, and the question of the support of the, the signing of a pact between Stalin and Hitler. But just like, I mean, people go, what? I can't tolerate that. Or come back in 1956, when Khrushchev, the then, or the president of, the head of Russia, not the president actually, but the supreme leader of the first secretary, thank you, of the Communist Party, ends up giving a speech talking about the crimes of the past. Thousands and thousands of people leave the Communist Party, but have nowhere to go. But it seems like their whole framework had collapsed. Now, I think that weighs very, very heavily on the problems that we face today, because the framework, we can say, but we never believed Russia was socialist. We were from the Trotskyists. Well, that's all well and good. And by the way, I'm not deprecating that. Without the voices of those who resisted then, we wouldn't exist today. But the fact is that the great majority of political activists worldwide shared some form of allegiance to that idea of socialism. And when it was renounced by people in South Africa or by the Ramaphosa's, who then switched sides, but there were also people who renounced it because they learned something about what they defended that they could no longer defend. Do you understand what I mean? I remember in the Euro-communist movement, in the late 1970s, early 80s, I'm showing my age here, but they produced an amazing study, essentially about Stalin's gulags, and it was printed by the French Communist Party. Now imagine that. For 50 years, you've been defending the USSR, then one day, your chief economist publishes a book that says, you know what, folks? Everything they said was actually true. Now that happens to the Russia-inspired socialist movement, and then happens to the China-inspired socialist movement when Mao Zedong comes, shakes hands with Richard Nixon, and you end up, and we should acknowledge it, the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, in which, you know, the Chinese workers' state butchered students and workers who were asking for, oh, guess what, the right to free speech, back to Marx's starting point. And China becomes the world manufacturing center for capitalism. Oh, but it's of course communist. Now, talk about mind warp. So you have that intellectually completely disorienting any idea of what the fight for socialism is. And of course that was picked up by the mainstream media. The end of socialism, look, socialism doesn't work, so on and so forth. But something else happened, which we don't always look at, which is that the collapse of the integration of China and the collapse of the USSR and of its satellites had a different practical effect, which is their integration into the world economy. Now, which has a huge impact on the rest of the world. And I'll put it this way. For those, historically speaking, I believe that the best way of explaining what Russia was a bureaucratic state capitalist country. Okay? It had a bureaucracy that ran it, but because of the pressures of the world economy, and especially competition, it effectively had capitalist relations between employee and employer, even though they weren't private employers. All right, you may or may not like the analogy. What's important is the Russian economy was shielded from that of the West, as was largely the Chinese. Now, ask yourself the question, why is it that the workers' movement internationally in the last 30 years has not been able to advance? Answer: the economic integration of huge swaths of the world directly into capitalist relations means that when people talk about fighting to maintain a standard of living, say here, but you have the entry into the world market of some 700 million workers. And by the way, I'm not ascribing any blame to Chinese or Russian workers. I'm simply saying capitalists want to produce more cheaply. Well, gee whiz. How is it that Germany, the place where people had the best living standards, second only to the United States, that contracts that have been in existence for 40 years, collective bargaining agreements, rights at work. Do you want to know what it means? I'm staying at the, it doesn't mean directly, but I'm staying at a hotel near the airport. I went in, I arrived very, very late last night, had dinner, and I'm looking around and it's 12:30, and there's groups of Teamsters still doing construction with their jackets. And I'm overhearing their conversation. They'd come from San Pedro. One guy was from LA proper, another guy from San, and they're working at 12:30. So I said, you guys working on overtime? Or the guy laughed at me like, what are you, an ignoramus? Well, that's true, but that's neither here nor there. What I mean is that when you try to talk about the fight against a capitalist offensive and saying that we are going to drive the social contract that existed after the Second World War and undo it, which is what they're doing. I mean, what they're talking about in Europe is going to pre-1945 days. I believe that's our future too. I believe that that's the future in store for us, unless there's a reappropriation, not just of the ideas of Marxism, but having them embodied in some kind of political organization and some kind of collective organization. Without that, we'll have periodic, and I hope we have more, but periodic mass upsurges. There's one going on in Brazil right now over the World Cup. But the World Cup will go, and the Olympics will come in, and then go, Gesundheit, and go and come. But the question is, what is left of the political organization from each one of these struggles? Some of them win, some of them fail, but what's the continuity, and what's the level of connection from one struggle to the next? And I think that the relevance of Marxism today is to try to bring together a framework that's revolutionary, that understands that this social system is likely, if it doesn't ecologically destroy us all, will continue apace without blinking an eyelash. And I think that that's really pretty hard for people in the US to envisage. But what's more stunning to me at one level is what's happened to the living standards of working class people and to the fiber and the culture of working class people in the last 30 years. And that's what's stunning. Real poverty, and I'm not saying it never existed, you know, but this country is a lot different. The level of working class organization compared to what existed even then is paltry. At the same time, I believe that working class consciousness that is transformed. You know, I used to hide this. I used to hide it. The worst question that we could ever be asked was, what do you do for a living? And my spouse would go, oh no, what's he going to say next? Because, you know, just to get on nerves sometimes. I'm a professional revolutionary. You know, not the thing you say in answer to a credit card question, which is why I never got any for 25 years. Plus I had no employer. Today, you can actually go around and people know who and what you are and think, not a bad thing. In terms of consciousness, you're not a pariah to be a radical. It's something that actually needs to be built on. And I think that we have a combination of extremely weak organization which poses real strategic problems. In other words, what's the connection between the immediate fight that you have to fight, say to school, and the long-term fight, and the fact that people can't do everything all the time? Okay, so one of the answers is a common organization. The problem is that a common organization needs to be of a certain size to begin to even gather steam. And we haven't yet gotten there. So if there's a point to be made in the talk, is that Marxism is the key for a world to win, but what people do actually matters. And I hope that we can spend the rest of the time discussing some of the ideas of Marxism, but also really want to stress that what people do matters. Of course, if everybody here wants to become a member of the ISO, that'll reshape the ISO. That's great. You'll be on the ground floor, you can determine what we do. Sorry, at least here. Not
Chicago, you have to wait in the line.
Oh, look. That's not just meant as a joke. It's actually, what we do is determined in part by who and what you have to make the decisions in doing them. But it's a project well worth doing. But even if that's not the choice of political engagement and running against the tired litany that people are just apathetic, know-nothings, I think is something that we have to stand up and say that we're not, and to begin to turn the corner in whatever ways that we can.